Winter, 1878. A snowbound cave high above Lonesome Ridge, Montana. Declan's eyes flew open as he caught Maeve's wrist in his trembling hand. Slowly, he lifted her herb and honey-stained fingers to his lips. His fever finally gone, but the hunger in his eyes impossible to hide. "So sweet," he whispered hoarsely. "Let me taste." Maeve froze, her breath catching as he gently pulled her closer. "Declan, you almost died. Then don't let me leave this world without knowing what it feels like to love you." Neither of them realized that this single moment inside the frozen cave would uncover a secret powerful enough to destroy the richest cattle baron in the West. If you enjoy unforgettable Western stories, be sure to subscribe and stay with us until the very end. The storm hit Lonesome Ridge like a fist. Rain came down in sheets, hammering the tin roofs, turning the main street into a river of mud. Lightning cracked white across the sky, and for 1 second the whole town lit up silver, then went black again. Maeve Sterling was awake. She was always awake this late, grinding dried yarrow at her workbench, the oil lamp throwing a small circle of gold light against the dark window. She liked the quiet hours. No one came to judge her jars of roots and tinctures at midnight. No one whispered about the strange Eastern woman who called herself a healer. Then the door shook, not a knock. A kick. Wood groaned against the hinges, and before she could stand, it burst open. Rain and wind pouring in behind a man she'd never seen up close. Big, soaked through, hat gone, dark hair plastered to his forehead. In his arms he carried another man, limp, blood soaking through a torn shirt and dripping onto her clean floor. "You're the healer." It wasn't a question. His voice was rough, low like gravel dragged over stone. Maeve didn't answer right away. Her eyes went to the wound first, the way they always did. A gash along the ribs, deep, still bleeding fast. The kind of wound that killed a man in an hour if nobody did anything. "Table," she said. Now, he didn't hesitate. He laid the injured man down across her work table, knocking a jar of dried lavender to the floor. It shattered. Neither of them looked at it. Doc Whitfield wouldn't open his door, the big man said. His jaw was tight. Saw Cal's face, saw the color of his skin, and told us to try somewhere else. Told us to try hell. More like. Maeve was already cutting away the shirt. Her hands moved fast, steady, the way they'd been trained to move back in Boston, in rooms full of men who didn't think a woman belonged there either. "What's your name?" she asked, not looking up. "Declan Hayes, and him. Cal works my ranch." A pause, worked it for 6 years. "He's not dying tonight. Not on my watch." "Then help me instead of standing there." That got his attention. He blinked, like he wasn't used to being given orders, especially not by a woman half his size, dressed in a nightgown with her hair loose down her back. But he moved. He held the lamp where she pointed. He pressed down where she told him to press. Maeve reached for her skirt and tore a long strip from the hem without a second thought. Silk didn't matter tonight. She folded it, pressed it hard against the wound to slow the bleeding, and called out for her satchel, echinacea root. She muttered, half to herself, "White willow bark. Yarrow, if the lavender's ruined." She worked with her whole body leaning into it, teeth gritted, sweat beading at her hairline despite the cold air pouring through the open door. Declan watched her hands. They didn't shake. Not once. "You've done this before," he said, "enough times." She threaded a needle by lamplight, hands quick and sure. "Hold him still." Cal groaned, half conscious, and Declan pinned his shoulders down without being asked twice. Outside, thunder rolled again, long and low, rattling the window panes. "Why help us?" Declan asked. His eyes stayed fixed on her face, studying her like he was trying to solve something. "Whitfield wouldn't. Half this town wouldn't spit on us if we were on fire." Maeve tied off a stitch before she answered. "Blood doesn't ask a man's blood before it decides to leave his body." She looked up at him then, straight on, no flinching. "I don't ask either." He didn't say anything to that, just watched her work, the muscles in his jaw loosening, just slightly, for the first time since he'd kicked the door open. The stitching took the better part of an hour. 12 stitches. clean and even, the kind that would leave a thin scar instead of a mangled one. When she finally straightened up, her back ached and her hands were stained red to the wrist. "He'll live," she said. "Fever might come tonight or tomorrow. When it does, keep him warm, not hot. Give him this." She pressed a small brown bottle into Declan's palm. "A spoonful, 3 times a day, until it's gone." Declan turned the bottle over in his hand like it might bite him. "What is it?" "Willow bark tea. Mostly. Keeps the fever from climbing too high." She wiped her hands on a rag, finally letting her shoulders drop. "It won't taste good. Nothing that works ever does." For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, just a small easing around his eyes. "Folks call you the witch woman," he said, "down at the saloon. Say you talk to plants." Folks also thought bleeding a man with leeches was good medicine 50 years ago. Maeve began gathering her tools, wiping the needle clean, setting the scissors back in their case. "I don't talk to plants, Mr. Hayes. I listen to what they can do. There's a difference." He looked at Cal, breathing steady now, color slowly returning to his face. Then he looked back at her. "I don't have much to pay you with. I didn't ask for payment. Everybody asks for something." Maeve met his eyes. Rain still dripped from his hair, pooling at his boots, mixing with the blood on her floor. He looked like a man who'd spent his whole life being told he wasn't wanted, standing in doorways, waiting to be turned away. "Not everybody," she said quietly. The storm outside hadn't let up. Wind screamed through the gap in the door. But here in the dim gold light of the apothecary, something had gone still. Declan Hayes studied her for a long moment, like he was trying to figure out what kind of person didn't slam a door on a bleeding half-breed, and his hired hand in the middle of the night. "He needs to stay put a few days," Maeve said, breaking the silence. "Moving him too soon could tear the stitches. I can't leave the ranch that long." "Then I'll come to you," she said it simply, like it wasn't even a decision, just a fact. "I have a horse. I know the roads well enough." Declan's brow furrowed. "You'd ride out to my land, alone. I've ridden through worse than a little mud, Mr. Hayes." He studied her a moment longer, rain dripping steadily from the brim of his coat onto the floorboards. Something passed behind his eyes. Disbelief, maybe, or the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet. "Most people in this town wouldn't cross the street for us," he said finally. "I'm not most people." Maeve turned back to her workbench, already reaching for a clean rag to wipe down her instruments. "Now get some rest, both of you. Morning's not far off. And Cal will need broth when he wakes." Declan nodded slowly, pulling a chair beside the table where Cal lay sleeping. He didn't leave. He sat down, boots soaked, coat still dripping, and kept watch over his friend like a man standing guard at the gates of something he intended to protect. Outside, the storm began to soften, thunder rolling farther into the distance, and in the small apothecary, lit by lamplight, something had quietly begun. Not a friendship yet, not trust, not entirely, but a thread, thin and stubborn, stretched between two people the world had decided didn't matter. Neither of them knew yet how far that thread would pull them. 3 days after the storm, Maeve saddled her mare and rode out to the Hayes Ranch. The morning was clear, the kind of blue sky that made the desert look almost forgiving. Dust kicked up behind her horse's hooves, and she kept her satchel close against her hip, packed with fresh bandages and a jar of salve she'd made that morning. Cal needed his wound checked. That was the reason, she told herself. Anyway, the ranch came into view slow. A low house with a sagging porch, a barn that had seen better decades, fences that leaned like tired old men. It wasn't much, but it was clean, in its own way. Swept dirt yard. Tools hung neat on the barn wall. Someone here cared, even if the land didn't have much left to give. Declan was out front, splitting wood, and he stopped when he heard her horse. "You actually came," he said. "I said I would." He set the axe down and wiped his hands on his trousers, up close in daylight. She could see him better than she had that stormy night. Sharp cheekbones, a scar that cut through one eyebrow, eyes the color of strong tea, watchful, like he was always waiting for something bad to happen. "Cal's inside," he said. Fever broke yesterday. Ate a whole bowl of stew this morning. Good. That's good. She dismounted, tying her horse to the post. I still want to look at the stitches. She spent the better part of an hour with Cal, checking the wound, changing the dressing, showing him how to keep it clean. He was a quiet man, gray at the temples, grateful in the way people are when they've learned not to expect much from the world. When she was done, she stepped back out onto the porch, and that's when she heard it. Water, or rather, the absence of it. Mr. Hayes, she said, where does your creek run? Declan came around the side of the house, drying his hands on a rag. Runs along the east ridge, feeds down through the lower pasture. Why? I don't hear it. He went still. Then he was moving, fast, cutting across the yard toward the trees that marked the property line. Maeve followed, her boots sinking in dry, cracked dirt that should have been soft and dark this time of year. They found the creek bed first. Empty, stones baked white in the sun. A few dead fish rotting in the last puddles. Then they found the men, 4 of them, up along the ridge, stacking logs and stone into a crude dam, sweat soaking through their shirts. A 5th man sat on a horse nearby, watching, a rifle resting across his lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. Declan's whole body changed. Maeve saw it happen, saw his shoulders square, his hands curl at his sides. That's Blackwood's men, he said, voice low. Stay back. She didn't stay back. She walked right up the slope, skirts gathered in one hand, and the man on the horse turned his rifle just slightly toward her before he seemed to register she was a woman, and lowered it a fraction, more out of habit than respect. This is Hayes' land, Declan called out. You've got no right building on it. The man on the horse smiled. He had gold teeth, the kind that caught the sun. Mr. Blackwood's got a survey says different. Says this creek belongs to the Circle B, and he's within his rights to manage his own water. That survey's a lie, and you know it, Declan said. Take it up with a judge. Then the man shrugged, easy, unbothered, till someone does. We're following orders. Maeve stepped forward before Declan could say another word. The armed men around the dam paused their work, watching her with the kind of amused curiosity men give to something they don't take seriously yet. Do you know what happens to land when a creek runs dry? She asked. Her voice wasn't loud. She didn't need it to be. The grass dies first, then the roots underneath, the ones that hold the soil together. Then when the rain finally does come, there's nothing left to catch it, so it washes the topsoil away entirely. Give it 2 seasons, and this whole valley turns to dust that won't grow anything, not even for the man who dammed it. The gold-toothed man laughed. That a threat? Ma'am, it's a fact. She looked past him, at the men still holding their shovels, waiting for instruction. Water is the blood of the earth. You cut it off. And it isn't just the flora that dies. Your own humanity dries up right along with it. Every one of you knows that, somewhere under all those orders you're following. Nobody laughed after that. One of the younger men, barely out of his teens by the look of him, lowered his shovel and glanced toward the others. Uncertain, the gold-toothed man noticed it too, and his jaw tightened. Get back to work, he barked. All of you. The men returned to stacking stone, though slower now, less certain in their movements. Declan reached out and took Maeve gently by the elbow, pulling her back down the slope, away from the rifle still resting across the man's saddle. You can't talk sense into men getting paid to ignore it, he said once they were clear. Maybe not. But somebody had to say it out loud. She glanced back up at the dam, half built already, water pooling uselessly behind it while the land below starved. Who is this Blackwood? Declan's face went hard. Cattleman, biggest spread in 3 counties. Buys out anyone who won't sell. And when buying doesn't work, he finds other ways. Other ways like starving a man's land of water. That's a gentle version of what he does. They walked the rest of the way back to the ranch house in silence, Maeve turning the scene over in her mind, replaying the way the young man had hesitated with his shovel. There was still decency in some of them. That was worth something, even if it wasn't much. At the porch, Declan finally spoke again. Why'd you do that? Walk right up to armed men like that? Maeve considered the question honestly before answering. Because somebody has to remind people that cruelty has a cost. even when it's easy to look away from it. Especially then. He studied her for a long moment, the same way he had that first night in her apothecary, like he was trying to work out what made a person like her. "You're not what I expected," he said finally, "when I heard there was a new healer in town. Figured you'd be some old woman with a black bag and no patience for anybody who looked like me. I grew up watching my mother turn away from patients who didn't fit her idea of respectable," Maeve said. "Watched good people die of things that didn't need to kill them, because the doctor in charge decided their lives mattered less. I promised myself I'd never be the kind of healer who did that. Is that why you came west?" "Partly." She looked out over the dying pasture, the dust settling slow in the afternoon light. "Boston has plenty of doctors. It doesn't have room for a woman who wants to practice medicine on her own terms. Out here, at least there's space to try." Declan nodded slowly, like something in that answer settled a question he hadn't asked out loud. "Well, space to try don't mean it's easy. Nothing worth doing ever is." She mounted her horse as the sun dropped lower, throwing long shadows across the cracked earth. Before she rode off, she looked back at him one more time. "I'll bring more sal for Cal in a few days," she said. "And Mr. Hayes, watch that creek. If it stays dry, your land won't hold through summer." "I know it," he said quietly. "Don't know what I can do about it, though. We'll think of something." She rode off before he could answer, leaving him standing in his dying yard, watching the dust rise behind her horse, wondering how a woman who'd been in town less than a month had already decided his fight was worth fighting. 2 weeks passed, and the creek stayed dry. Maeve spent her mornings in the hills, gathering what she could before the heat became unbearable. She'd found a valley to the north, thick with sage and yarrow, a stand of cottonwoods that somehow still held green, despite the drought choking the rest of the territory. It became her favorite place to work, quiet, private, far enough from town that nobody bothered her there. She was on her knees, digging up a cluster of echinacea root, when she heard the horses. At first she thought little of it. Riders passed through these hills sometimes, cattlemen checking herds, the occasional traveler. But something in the rhythm of the hoofbeats made her pause, made her set down her trowel and listen harder. They were moving fast, too fast for a casual ride. She crept toward the ridgeline and looked down into the next valley, where a small homestead sat nestled against a stand of rock. A cabin, a barn, a garden plot that had clearly been someone's pride, now brown and wilting from lack of water, and riding hard toward it. 5 men. Maeve dropped to her stomach in the thorn brush without thinking, some old instinct telling her this wasn't a scene meant for witnesses. The men reached the cabin and dismounted. She recognized the gold-toothed man from the creek, still smiling that same easy smile, even as he pulled a torch from his saddlebag and lit it against a lantern one of his companions carried. A family came out onto the porch, a man, a woman, 2 children clinging to her skirts. Maeve couldn't hear every word from that distance, but she heard enough. Something about a debt, something about a deadline that had passed. The homesteader's voice rose, pleading, gesturing toward his dying garden, explaining there was no way to pay when the water had been cut off from 3 different properties this season alone. The gold-toothed man's smile never wavered. He said something short, and then he threw the torch onto the roof. The cabin went up fast, old wood, dry as kindling after weeks without rain. Maeve watched the family scramble back, watched the mother pull her children away from the flames, watched the father stand frozen for one terrible second before turning to save what he could from inside. She pressed her palm against her mouth to keep from making a sound. The riders didn't stay to watch it burn. They mounted up and rode off, laughing about something, as casual as men leaving a saloon after a hand of cards. Behind them, the cabin collapsed into itself, sending a column of black smoke up into the clear blue sky, and the family stood in their yard, with nothing left but each other. Maeve stayed hidden until she was sure the riders were gone. Then she made her way down, carefully, to help however she could. The mother was crying, quiet, exhausted tears, the kind that came from somewhere too deep for loud sobbing. Maeve helped them gather what had survived: a few blankets, a cast iron pot, a small tin box of documents the father had thought to grab first. Land papers, he explained, hands shaking as he opened the box. Deed, everything my father left me. Maeve looked at the papers with him, and something caught her eye immediately. The boundary lines on his deed didn't match what she'd seen on a survey map posted outside the land office in town, the one bearing Josiah Blackwood's official seal. "May I look closer?" she asked. The man nodded, too tired to question why a stranger wanted to study his ruined family's paperwork. Maeve traced the boundary description with her finger, comparing it against what she remembered of the terrain. The creek lines, the ridges she'd walked countless times gathering herbs. The two didn't match, not even close. She thought of the ecological patterns she'd been tracking for weeks now, almost without meaning to. The way certain plants only grew along specific soil lines. The way old growth timber marked boundaries that had existed since before any survey was ever drawn. It was the kind of knowledge nobody thought to use for anything practical. But knowledge was knowledge, and she'd spent her whole life believing it could be a weapon for good, if a person knew how to wield it properly. "Blackwood's maps are wrong," she said quietly. The homesteader looked up at her, confused. "What?" "The boundary lines his survey claims. They don't follow the actual terrain. I've walked these hills for weeks. I know where the water tables sit, where the old growth stands, and none of it lines up with what his map shows." She folded the deed carefully and handed it back. "Keep this safe. It might matter more than you know." She spent the next several days working in secret, sketching her own map from memory and careful observation, marking where certain root systems ran deep enough to indicate old creek beds, where specific wildflowers only bloomed along original treaty boundaries that predated any of Blackwood's paperwork. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required patience and precision. And she did it by lamplight, after the apothecary closed each night. She didn't tell Declan yet, not until she was certain. But somebody talked. Somebody always talked. She returned to her shop one morning to find the door already open, the shelves stripped bare, jars smashed on the floor, dried herbs scattered and trampled into the wood grain. Standing in the middle of the wreckage was a man she'd never met, well-dressed, silver-haired, with the kind of cold, patient eyes that made her skin prickle even before he spoke. "Miss Sterling," he said, "I don't believe we've had the pleasure. You have me at a disadvantage. Josiah Blackwood." He said his own name the way other men said a title, like it should mean something significant all on its own. "I hear you've been walking my land, taking notes." "I've been gathering herbs. That's my trade. Is that what you call it?" He stepped closer, careful not to touch the broken glass under his boots. "I understand you've also been comparing survey lines, redrawing boundaries based on what grows where. That's an interesting hobby for an apothecary." Maeve kept her spine straight, refusing to let him see the fear crawling up her throat. The truth doesn't care whose hobby uncovers it. "Mr. Blackwood," his expression didn't change. Not exactly. But something behind his eyes went colder still. "This is a rough territory. Miss Sterling, accidents happen. Fires happen. I'd hate for something to happen to a woman so far from home, with no family to speak for her if things went badly. Is that a threat?" "It's a kindness. I'm giving you the chance to mind your own business before matters get complicated." He turned toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at her ruined shop. "As of today, no merchant in this town will sell you food, supplies, or materials of any kind. You'll find that surviving out here without cooperation is considerably harder than reading old boundary lines." He left without waiting for her response, his boots crunching over broken glass on his way out, and Maeve stood alone in the wreckage of everything she'd built since arriving in this territory. Her hands trembled, not from fear exactly, but from the particular fury that came from being underestimated by a man who thought a threat would be enough to silence her. She knelt down amid the broken jars and began, slowly, carefully, to salvage what she could. Word of the embargo spread fast, faster than Maeve expected. By the following morning, the general store owner wouldn't meet her eyes when she walked in. mumbling something about supply shortages before turning her away at the counter. The feed store did the same. Even the well behind the church, the one everyone in town used freely, ran suddenly dry whenever she showed up with her buckets. She held out for 3 days on what little remained in her ruined shop before pride gave way to necessity. Declan found her on the road outside town, walking with a bundle of salvaged supplies balanced on her back, sweat soaking through her collar in the afternoon heat. He pulled his wagon alongside her without a word and simply held out a hand to help her up. "Word travels," he said once she was settled beside him. "Heard what Blackwood did to your shop. I'll manage. Won't manage long without food or water." He clicked his tongue at the horses, urging them forward. "Come stay at the ranch. Got room. And Cal could use the company while he heals." Maeve wanted to refuse, some old instinct telling her it wasn't proper. A woman alone with 2 men on an isolated ranch. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Not with Blackwood, determined to starve her into leaving. "Just until I find another arrangement," she said. Course. The ranch became her home for the following weeks. And in that time, something shifted between her and Declan that neither of them quite named out loud. He taught her first how to read the desert properly, not just as a place full of plants worth harvesting, but as a living system with its own rules for survival. He showed her how to track rabbit trails through dry brush, how to find water hidden beneath certain rock formations by watching where birds gathered at dawn. "See that cluster of doves," he said one morning, pointing toward a rocky outcrop half a mile off. "They don't gather without reason. There's water under those stones, even in drought like this." Maeve watched the birds circle and land, disappearing behind the rocks. "How do you know things like that?" "My mother's people knew this land before any survey ever touched it. Knew how to read it the way you read your books." Something flickered across his face. Old grief mixed with old pride. Didn't think much of that knowledge growing up. Town kids called it savage nonsense. Took me years to understand. It was the smartest thing anybody ever taught me. It's not nonsense. It's observation. Same as medicine. Really. You watch. You learn the patterns. You trust what the land tells you instead of forcing your own assumptions onto it. He glanced at her sideways. Something like respect settling into his expression. Never had anybody put it that way before. Maeve taught him what she knew, showing him which of the plants scattered across his dying property still held medicinal value, which roots could be dried and stored for winter, which bark could ease fever or clean a wound when nothing else was available. "Your grandmother would have known half of this already," she said one afternoon, kneeling beside a patch of prickly pear, demonstrating how to safely harvest the pads without getting spined. "The native peoples out here have been using these plants for generations. It's only outsiders like me who need to relearn what your family already understood." "She died before she could teach me much of anything," Declan admitted. "My father wasn't around to fill in what she left behind. Learned most of what I know from making mistakes and surviving them. That's its own kind of education. Harder way to learn than reading a book, maybe, but it sticks better, in my experience." She handed him a strip of prepared cactus, showing him how the moisture inside could sustain a person through the worst of the drought. Knowledge that costs you something usually does. Evenings on the ranch settled into an easy rhythm neither of them acknowledged out loud. Cal healed steadily, strong enough within 2 weeks to help with light chores again. And in the quiet hours after supper, the three of them would sit on the porch while the desert cooled and the stars came out thick and bright overhead. Declan talked more during those evenings than Maeve suspected he had in years. He told her about his father, a white rancher who never once acknowledged him publicly. About growing up, caught between two worlds and welcomed fully by neither. He told her about the ranch, inherited through a legal technicality nobody expected to hold up, and how he'd spent every year since fighting to keep it. First against neighbors who resented his existence, now against a cattle baron determined to erase him entirely. "Why not sell?" Maeve asked one evening, genuinely curious. "Take Blackwood's money. Start somewhere new, somewhere easier." Declan considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because this land is the only thing that never once asked what I was before deciding whether I belonged. Dirt don't care out blood. Neither does the water. When it's actually running. He looked out over the darkening fields. Man gives that up. He's got nothing left holding him to anything. Maeve understood that better than she expected to. She'd left her entire life behind in Boston, chasing something similar. Some place that would judge her by her actual work instead of her gender, her unconventional choices. Her refusal to fit into the narrow role expected of her were not so different. You and I, she said quietly. No, Declan agreed. Guess we're not. Something passed between them in that moment. Unspoken but unmistakable. A recognition of shared struggle that ran deeper than either of them had words for yet. Declan's guarded distance, built over years of disappointment and rejection, had begun to soften in ways he didn't fully understand himself. And Maeve found herself trusting him with pieces of her past she'd never shared with anyone since arriving west. Not because he demanded it, but because he simply listened, without judgment, the way almost nobody in her life ever had. They didn't speak of what was growing between them. Not yet, but it was there, quiet and steady as the desert itself, taking root in soil that had been salted and burned and left for dead, proving that even the harshest ground could still find a way to grow something worth keeping. The raid came at night, the way cowardice always does, to the smell of smoke. Before she heard the shouting, she sat up fast, disoriented for half a second in the unfamiliar dark of the ranch's spare room, until the acrid burn in her throat reminded her where the smell was coming from. Not the ranch, town. She threw on her boots and ran for the window. Orange light flickered against the horizon, too bright and too close to be anything but her shop. Declan was already outside, saddling his horse in the moonlight, moving with the kind of speed that came from a lifetime of preparing for the worst. That's my apothecary, Maeve said, breathless, already reaching for the second horse. I know it. His voice was flat, controlled in the way men get when panic would cost them everything. Stay here. Absolutely not. He didn't argue further. There wasn't time. They rode hard into town, hooves throwing up dust that caught the firelight, and turned to gold sparks trailing behind them. By the time they arrived, half the street had gathered to watch, some helping pass buckets from the well, most just standing, faces lit orange, doing nothing at all. The shop was already lost. Flames climbed through the roof, consuming 2 years of careful work in a matter of minutes. The dried herbs and tinctures inside feeding the fire instead of fighting it. Maeve stood frozen for a moment, watching everything she'd built turn to smoke and ash, before her legs finally moved on their own. There might be something left inside, she said, already running toward the door. Declan grabbed her arm. You go in there. You don't come out. My research is in there. Years of mapping. Notes on the treaty boundaries. Everything that proves what Blackwood's done. It's not worth your life. It might be worth this whole territory's future. She pulled free before he could stop her, and pushed through the front door into a wall of heat and smoke, thick enough to swallow the world. Declan didn't hesitate. He went in right behind her. Inside was chaos, shelves collapsing, flames licking up the walls, smoke so heavy she could barely see her own hands in front of her face. Maeve dropped low, crawling toward the back room where she kept her ledgers and maps, coughing hard enough to double her over. She found the metal box where she stored her most important papers, the boundary sketches, the notes comparing Blackwood's forged survey against the actual terrain. She grabbed it just as a support beam overhead groaned, cracking under the weight of the burning roof. Maeve, Declan's voice, sharp with fear she'd never heard in him before. She turned just as the beam gave way, falling toward the spot where she knelt. There wasn't time to move. There wasn't time to do anything. Declan threw himself across the room and shoved her clear, taking the impact meant for her against his own back and side. Something cracked, wood or bone. She couldn't tell in the chaos. And a gunshot sound rang out that she realized a half-second later wasn't wood splitting at all. Somewhere in the burning wreckage, a stray bullet from someone's earlier gunfire, or maybe a cartridge left too close to the flames, had gone off, and Declan grunted, staggering. One hand pressed hard against his ribs. Declan, I'm fine. Move, he wasn't fine. She could see that, even through the smoke, the way he favored his side, the dark stain already spreading beneath his fingers. But there wasn't time to argue. The whole structure was coming down around them. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door, and together they stumbled out into the night air, lungs burning, just as the roof finally collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks and ash. The crowd gasped and surged back from the heat. Maeve barely registered any of it. All her attention narrowed down to Declan, who'd gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold night air. "Let me see," she said, hands already moving to his side. Not here, his jaw was tight. Eyes, scanning the crowd with a wariness she understood immediately. Word would already be spreading that they'd been the ones inside the fire. If Blackwood's men were watching, and they surely were. Staying in town any longer only invited more violence. The ranch, then can't. He shook his head, wincing at the movement. They'll come for the ranch next. Burned my house before. They'll do it again. And this time, they won't miss. Maeve understood the calculation instantly, the way her mind had learned to work in emergencies. Fast and clear, even when fear threatened to crowd everything else out. The mountains, then, somewhere they won't think to look. There's a cave, up past the North Ridge, near the old treaty markers. He was already moving toward the horses, one arm pressed hard against his bleeding side. 2 hours ride, maybe 3 in the dark. You're bleeding. Declan, you shouldn't ride at all. Staying here gets us both killed. She didn't have an answer for that, because it was true. She helped him onto his horse, climbed onto her own, and together they rode north into the darkness, leaving the burning wreckage of everything she'd built behind them. Smoke rising into a sky just beginning to lighten toward a gray, uncertain dawn. The ride was slow and brutal. Declan's wound worsened with every mile. The bullet lodged somewhere in the muscle along his ribs, bleeding steadily, despite the strip of shirt Maeve had wrapped tight around it back in town. By the time they reached the cave, a narrow opening tucked into the rock face along the North Ridge. He could barely stay upright in the saddle. She got him inside, laid him against the cold stone floor, and immediately set to work assessing the damage by the thin gray light filtering through the entrance. The wound was worse than she'd feared, deep enough that she couldn't be certain the bullet hadn't fragmented, the flesh around it already showing signs of infection setting in. "I need supplies," she said more to herself than to him. "Clean water. Something for the fever that's coming." "Coat pocket," Declan managed, voice thin. "Always carry a little kit. Salt, whiskey, needle, and thread." She found it, grateful for whatever instinct had made him prepare for exactly this kind of disaster. She cleaned the wound as best she could with the whiskey, ignoring his sharp intake of breath, and packed it with what herbs remained in her own satchel. Precious little compared to what she'd lost in the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first bitter edge of a storm rolling down from higher elevations. By nightfall, snow had begun to fall, thick and relentless, the kind of sudden mountain blizzard that could bury a trail in hours and strand travelers for days. They were trapped. Declan's fever climbed through the night, his skin burning hot despite the cold seeping into the cave from outside. Maeve worked by the light of a small fire she'd managed to build from what dry brush she could find near the entrance, tending his wound, forcing sips of water past his cracked lips, watching him slip in and out of a delirium that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. "Cal," he muttered at one point, eyes glassy and unfocused. "Get Cal out. Fire's coming." "Cal's safe," she said softly, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "You're safe. Just rest." He didn't seem to hear her, caught somewhere in memories she couldn't reach, muttering names she didn't recognize, apologies to people long gone. She sat beside him through the worst of it, changing his dressing every few hours, watching the wound for signs it was healing instead of spreading, feeding the small fire whatever fuel she could find without leaving his side for long. By the second day, the blizzard showed no sign of breaking. Snow piled high against the cave entrance, and the cold crept deeper into the stone with every passing hour. Declan's fever hadn't broken. If anything, it had worsened. His breathing shallow and uneven, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that made her chest tight with something close to panic. She'd seen infections like this before, back in Boston, in patients who hadn't made it, despite every intervention available. She refused to let this become the same story. Searching through what remained of her satchel, she found only a handful of dried leaves left. Precious remnants of a plant she'd gathered weeks earlier from the high slopes, one known among certain native healers for drawing infection out of deep wounds. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to properly treat a wound this severe, but it would have to be enough. She needed something to bind the mixture, something that would hold the medicine against the wound and help it work through the night. Searching the cave by firelight, she found what she needed clinging to the rock near the entrance. Wild honeycomb, built into a crevice by bees that had long since abandoned it for the season. It was risky work, scraping the combs free in the freezing dark, fingers numb. But she managed it, carrying the sticky harvest back to the fire. She crushed the dried leaves between two stones, working them into a fine powder, then mixed them carefully with the honey until it formed a thick, dark paste, fragrant with the bitter green scent of the herbs beneath the sweetness of the comb. "This is going to hurt," she murmured, though she doubted he could hear her in his current state. She worked quick, applying the salve directly to the wound, wrapping it tight with the cleanest strips of cloth she had left. Declan groaned, low and rough, but didn't fully wake, his body still locked in fever's grip. There was nothing left to do after that but wait and keep him warm. The temperature in the cave had dropped dangerously low, the small fire barely enough to hold back the worst of the cold seeping through the stone. Maeve made a decision she wouldn't have considered under any other circumstance, lying down beside him, pressing her body close against his, sharing what warmth she had left to give. It wasn't improper. Not here, not now, not with his life hanging in the balance. It was simply survival. The same instinct that had guided every choice she'd made since the fire began. She stayed awake through most of that night, monitoring his breathing, checking the wound periodically by the dim firelight, praying in whatever quiet way she still remembered from a childhood spent in church pews she'd long since stopped attending. Somewhere near dawn, exhaustion finally won, and she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, still curled against him, still listening, even in her dreams, for any change in his breathing that might mean the fever had finally broken. Maeve woke to sunlight, not the gray, filtered light of the storm, but something warmer, something that meant the blizzard had finally passed. She sat up slowly, disoriented, every muscle stiff from a night spent on cold stone. And her first thought, immediate and sharp, was Declan. He was watching her. His eyes were clear, not glassy with fever, not lost in delirium, but focused, alert, tracking her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're awake," she said, relief flooding through her, so suddenly it made her hands shake. She pressed her palm to his forehead, and the heat that had radiated off him for 2 days had finally cooled to something closer to normal. "The fever broke. Feels like it." His voice was rough, dry from disuse, but steady in a way it hadn't been since the fire. "How long was I out?" 2 days. Almost 3. She reached for the water skin, helping him drink slowly, watching him carefully for any sign the fever might still return. "I wasn't certain you'd make it through last night. You stayed." "Of course I stayed." He studied her in the morning light, taking in what must have been an exhausted, disheveled sight, her hair loose and tangled, her clothes stained with soot and blood, dark circles beneath her eyes from 2 sleepless nights of tending him. His gaze dropped to her hands, still faintly stained with the herbal salve she'd mixed the night before. Sticky traces of honey caught beneath her fingernails. Slowly, carefully, as if testing whether his body would cooperate, he reached out and took her hand. Maeve went still, watching him, unsure what he intended, until he brought her fingers to his lips. He tasted the salve there, the mixture of bitter herb and sweet honey still clinging faintly to her skin. And something shifted behind his eyes, something that had been building quietly between them for weeks, finally breaking loose from whatever restraint had held it back. "So sweet," he murmured, voice low and rough. "Let me taste." Maeve's heart pounded, her breath catching in her throat as he pressed a slow kiss against her palm, then her wrist, his eyes never leaving hers. She should have pulled away. Some old proper part of her insisted she should. But 3 years on this frontier had taught her that the rules she'd been raised with didn't always account for moments like this one. Moments carved out of survival and exhaustion, and the particular tenderness that grows between two people who have watched death come close and turned it away together. "Declan," she whispered, "tell me to stop, and I will." She didn't tell him to stop. Instead, she leaned down, closing the distance between them, and let him pull her the rest of the way into a kiss that tasted of honey and herbs and something deeper than either. Something that had been growing quietly for weeks in shared silences and small kindnesses, in lessons about desert survival traded for lessons about healing plants in the particular way. Trust builds slowly between two people who've spent their whole lives being told they don't belong anywhere. His hand came up to cup her jaw, careful despite the urgency building between them, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers, whether from lingering weakness or something else entirely. She couldn't say. She kissed him back with a tenderness that surprised her, mindful of his injury, mindful of everything they'd survived together to reach this exact moment, when they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily. Declan searched her face for any sign of hesitation. "I've got nothing to offer you," he said quietly. "No proper home left standing. No name this territory respects. Just dirt that won't hold water and a target on my back that Blackwood's determined to finish. I'm not looking for what this territory considers proper." Maeve traced her thumb along the scar through his eyebrow, the same one she'd noticed that first stormy night in her apothecary. "I came out here because proper never made room for people like us. Not for a woman who wanted to practice real medicine. Not for a man born between two worlds that both refused to claim him. So, what are you looking for? Someone who sees what's actually worth protecting in this world, and fights for it anyway, even when the whole territory's stacked against him." She leaned down and kissed him again, softer this time. "Think I've found it." What followed was unhurried, careful, shaped by his healing wound and the particular reverence that comes from two people who nearly lost each other choosing, deliberately, to hold on instead. Declan's hands moved with a gentleness that contradicted every rough edge the world had carved into him, and Maeve gave herself over to it fully, to him, fully, in the quiet privacy of a cave that had sheltered them through the worst the mountain could offer. Afterward, they lay together beneath the blankets, the small fire burning low, morning light spilling gold across the stone floor. Declan's arm wrapped around her, careful of his healing ribs, and Maeve rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat settle into something calm, and even for the first time in days. "I used to think this land was cursed," he said quietly, into the stillness. "Everything I ever tried to build on it, somebody tried to burn down or steal away. Started believing maybe I brought that trouble with me, just by existing." "You didn't bring anything but the will to survive it," Maeve said. "That's not a curse. Declan, that's the only reason either of us made it through last night." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing slow patterns against her shoulder. "Never thought I'd let myself want something like this. Figured wanting things just gave the world one more way to take something from me. I understand that fear better than you might think." She tilted her head to look up at him. "But some things are worth the risk of losing them. I think this might be one." He pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, and for a while, neither of them spoke, content simply to exist together in the quiet aftermath. Two people who'd spent their whole lives as outcasts finding, unexpectedly, a place that finally felt like it belonged to both of them. Outside, the storm had fully passed, leaving the mountain washed, clean and glittering under fresh snow. sunlight catching on ice crystals scattered across the rocks near the cave entrance. Neither of them noticed yet the strange dark red foliage growing thick along the cliff face just beyond the opening, ancient and rare, waiting to be discovered when morning fully arrived. For now there was only this: the fire burning low, the mountain silent and still, and two people who had finally, after everything, allowed themselves to be found by something worth keeping. Maeve woke a second time to find the cave empty of warmth beside her, though Declan hadn't gone far. She found him near the entrance, standing carefully, one hand braced against the rock wall, staring out at something with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You should be resting," she said, moving to his side. "Look at this." She followed his gaze to the cliff face just beyond the cave opening, and for a moment she forgot entirely about his injury, about the cold, about anything except what was growing there in front of them. A stretch of deep red foliage climbed along the rock, thick clusters of leaves, in a color she'd never seen in any plant catalog back east, vivid crimson against the gray stone and white snow. It ran in an unbroken line along the cliff, following some pattern that seemed too deliberate to be random growth. "What is that?" Declan asked. Maeve stepped closer, careful of the ice underfoot, and knelt beside the nearest cluster. She examined the leaves. The branching structure, the way the roots dug deep into cracks in the rock, rather than spreading wide the way most cliff vegetation did. "I don't know the common name," she admitted, "but I've read about plants like this. Botanists back east call them indicator species. They only grow where very specific conditions exist. Certain soil minerals, certain water tables, certain elevation and exposure to sun." She traced her finger along a low branch, careful not to damage it. "They don't grow just anywhere, Declan. They grow along old lines, geological lines, sometimes boundary lines that predate any survey a person could draw with a compass and paper." Understanding dawned slowly across his face. "Treaty lines, possibly." She stood, following the line of red foliage, as far as she could see it, stretching along the cliff, disappearing around a bend in the rock face. The original treaty boundaries. The ones drawn before your father's generation, before Blackwood's kind ever showed up with their surveys and their money. Those lines followed natural features, rivers, ridgelines, sometimes very specific elevations where certain minerals concentrate in the soil. "You think this plant only grows along that exact boundary?" "I think it's worth investigating properly." Maeve turned back to him, feeling something electric building beneath her exhaustion. The particular thrill of a discovery that might actually matter. "If I can document this properly, trace where it grows, compare it against the original treaty descriptions, it could prove definitively where the real boundary sits. Not Blackwood's forged version, the actual line, the one that existed before he ever touched a pen to paper." Declan looked at the crimson growth stretching along the cliff, then back at her. Something like hope flickering behind the exhaustion still etched into his face. "That's the kind of evidence a federal judge would take seriously." "It's exactly that kind of evidence." Maeve felt her heart pounding now. Not with fear, but with purpose. Living proof, growing right out of the ground, that can't be forged or bribed or burned the way paperwork can be. Nature doesn't lie, Declan. It just tells the truth to anyone patient enough to read it properly. They spent the following hours documenting what they could. Maeve sketching the plant's growth pattern in the small notebook she always kept tucked in her coat, noting elevation, the direction the cliff face ran, the exact points where the red foliage appeared and where it stopped. Declan, despite her protests, insisted on helping, moving carefully along the ridge to note landmarks he recognized from a lifetime spent on this land, cross-referencing what she found against boundary markers his own family had once maintained before Blackwood's influence erased most of the old system entirely. "There," he said at one point, pointing to a weathered stone half buried in snow near the tree line. "Old marker. My grandfather showed me this when I was a boy, before he passed," said it marked where the original treaty line ran. Back before anybody in this territory started arguing over deeds and surveys. Maeve knelt beside the stone, brushing away snow to reveal faint carved markings, worn nearly smooth by decades of weather, but still visible if a person knew to look closely. She compared its position against the line of red foliage, still visible, climbing the cliff above them. They matched perfectly. "This is it," she said, barely able to keep the excitement from her voice. "This is exactly what we need. A natural indicator species, confirmed by an original boundary marker, both pointing to the same line. No forged survey can argue with two independent forms of evidence agreeing this precisely." Declan studied the marker for a long moment, something complicated passing across his face. "My grandfather tried to fight for this land using markers like this one. Judge back then wouldn't even look at it. Said an old stone didn't mean anything against a proper legal survey. Times are different now," Maeve said, though she understood his hesitation. "Federal courts have started taking scientific evidence more seriously, especially when it comes from someone with actual credentials. I trained under respected botanists in Boston. My testimony, backed by careful documentation like this, carries weight a stone marker alone might not have carried 30 years ago. You're offering to testify against Blackwood. I'm offering to tell the truth in front of whoever will listen." She met his eyes steadily. "That's what I came west to do, Declan. Practice medicine on my own terms. Live according to my own conscience, regardless of what proper society expects from women like me. This is exactly the kind of fight I came out here, believing I could actually win." He reached for her hand, careful of his still healing side, and pressed a slow kiss against her knuckles. "Then we'll win it together." They worked through the remainder of the day, gathering samples where they could do so without damaging the growth pattern too severely, sketching maps, referencing everything against what remained of Declan's memory of his grandfather's old boundary descriptions. By evening, exhaustion had caught up with both of them again, Declan's wound beginning to ache from the day's activity, despite his attempts to hide it from her. "You need to rest properly," Maeve said, noticing the tightness around his eyes as they settled back near the fire for the night. "Tomorrow we start down the mountain. That wound needs proper care, not field dressing in a cave. And the judge, I heard talk in town before the fire. Word was a federal judge was traveling through the territory on routine business, checking on several ongoing land disputes." She frowned, trying to remember exact details through the haze of exhaustion and everything that happened since. "If my memory serves, he was expected to pass through within the next week or two, coming in by rail from the Eastern Territories. That doesn't give us much time." "No, it doesn't." She looked back toward the cave entrance, toward the crimson foliage barely visible now in the fading light. "But it's enough, if we move carefully and don't waste what we've found here." They slept close together again that night, though the urgency of what lay ahead kept sleep thin and restless for both of them. Maeve found herself listening to every sound outside the cave, every shift of wind or crack of ice, half convinced Blackwood's men might somehow track them even here. This deep into mountains, most people avoided entirely. Morning came clear and cold, the sky a hard, bright blue that promised good traveling conditions despite the fresh snow still blanketing the ground. Declan moved stiffly as they prepared to leave, favoring his injured side, but insisted he was strong enough to make the ride back down toward civilization. "We need supplies before anything else," he said, checking the horses they'd left tethered near the cave entrance. Grateful they'd survived the blizzard, reasonably well sheltered as they were, beneath an overhang of rock. "And I need to check on Cal. Been gone 3 days already. He'll be worried sick. Assuming Blackwood's men haven't found him first." "Do you think they might have?" "Cal's smart. Knows how to keep his head down when trouble's close." Declan swung up into his saddle, wincing slightly at the movement. "But I won't rest easy till I see him with my own eyes." They rode down from the mountains slowly, careful of ice on the narrow trail, Maeve's notebook and sketches carefully secured in her satchel, alongside what few samples of the crimson foliage she'd managed to preserve. The ride gave her time to think, to plan out exactly how she intended to present this evidence. What arguments would carry the most weight with a federal judge unfamiliar with local politics or personal grudges? I'll need proper specimens, she said, thinking out loud as much as speaking to Declan. Pressed and preserved correctly, not just rough sketches. And I should write up a formal comparison between the plant's documented growth requirements and the original treaty boundary descriptions, if I can find copies of those original documents anywhere in town. County Records Office might have copies, Declan offered, assuming Blackwood hasn't gotten to those too. We'll find out soon enough. They reached the ranch by mid-afternoon, relief flooding through both of them at finding the property still standing, Cal alive and well, despite 3 anxious days, without word from either of them. He came out onto the porch the moment he heard their horses, worry etched deep into his weathered face. Thought maybe you two were dead, he said, helping Declan down from his horse with obvious concern at the careful way he moved. Whole town's been talking about the fire. Some folks saying you both died in it. Not yet, Declan said, managing a tired smile. Got close, though. Cal's eyes moved to the bandage visible beneath Declan's torn shirt, understanding immediately that whatever happened up in those mountains had cost more than a few sleepless nights. Blackwood's been asking around town, trying to find out what happened to you both. Word is he's not happy you survived. He'll be less happy once we're through with him, Maeve said, already moving toward the house, mind racing ahead to everything that needed doing before they could present their evidence properly. The following days passed in a blur of careful, exhausting work. Maeve pressed her plant specimens between sheets of paper weighted down with stones, preserving them as best she could without proper equipment. She wrote and rewrote her comparison between the crimson foliage's growth pattern and the original treaty descriptions she managed to locate in the county records office. Working late into each night by candlelight, while Declan slowly recovered from his injury, Cal proved invaluable during this time, riding into town discreetly to gather information about the judge's expected arrival, careful not to draw Blackwood's attention to their preparations. He returned one evening with news that settled the timeline firmly for them. Judge is coming in by train, he reported, settling into a chair at their kitchen table. Word is he's arriving in 6 days, doing his routine circuit through territorial land disputes before heading back east. 6 days, Maeve repeated, calculating quickly in her mind everything still left to accomplish. That should be enough time, if we don't waste a single one of them. Declan, sitting across from her with his wound healing steadily beneath fresh bandages, she'd changed that morning, studied her with quiet admiration. You really think this evidence will hold up against everything Blackwood's bought and paid for over the years? I think truth has a particular weight to it when it's presented properly, Maeve said. Blackwood's built his entire operation on forged paperwork and intimidation. He's never had to defend his claims against actual scientific evidence because nobody's ever bothered gathering it before. That gives us an advantage he won't be expecting. And if he tries to stop us before we ever reach the judge? The question hung heavy in the kitchen, both of them understanding exactly what kind of man Blackwood had already proven himself to be. Fire dynamite. Intimidation backed by hired guns willing to burn a homestead to the ground over unpaid debts. A man like that wouldn't simply stand aside and let his entire operation collapse over a plant growing wild on a mountainside. Then we'll be ready for that too, Declan said finally, quiet determination settling into his voice. This land's worth fighting for. Always has been. Difference now is we've got something worth fighting with, instead of just fighting back. Maeve reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture that had passed between them countless times since that night in the cave, though it carried new weight now, understanding fully what the coming days might demand from both of them. 6 days, she said again, more to herself than anyone else in the room. We make every single one of them count. Word reached Blackwood on the 4th day. Maeve never learned exactly how he found out, whether through a careless word overheard in town or a spy planted among his enemies. But by the time Cal rode back to the ranch that evening, his face told her everything. before he even dismounted. He knows, Cal said, breathless from hard riding. Somehow he knows about the evidence, about the judge coming through. Saw his men gathering near the old mining road, loading crates onto wagons. What kind of crates? Declan asked, already moving toward his rifle, propped against the wall. Cal's expression answered before his words did. Dynamite, enough to bring down half that cliff face. From what I could tell, watching from a distance. Maeve's stomach dropped. He means to destroy the evidence before we can present it, and bury us alongside it, most likely, if we're anywhere near that cave when it happens. Declan checked his rifle with quick, practiced movements. The weakness from his healing wound seeming to fall away beneath sheer determination. How much time do we have? Judge's train arrives day after tomorrow, according to what I heard in town, Cal said. Blackwood's men are moving tonight. Aim to blow that cliff before the judge ever gets close enough to see what's growing there. Maeve's mind raced through the implications. The careful documentation she'd prepared, the pressed specimens, the comparison notes, all of it worthless if Blackwood succeeded in destroying the living proof itself. Written testimony alone, without the actual evidence to support it, would crumble against a wealthy cattleman's word, especially with judges known to favor established interests over unproven claims from outsiders and half-breeds. We need to get back up that mountain before they do, she said. If we can document the site more thoroughly before it's destroyed, gather additional specimens, we might still have enough to make our case, even if the original site is lost. That's a full day's ride. Minimum. Even pushing the horses hard, Declan said. We'd be riding straight into whatever men Blackwoods got stationed along that route. Do we have another choice? The question sat heavy in the room, all three of them understanding exactly what was at stake. Not just Maeve's evidence, not just Declan's land, but every homesteader Blackwood had ever cheated. Every family driven off their property through forged deeds and manufactured debts. Every person in this territory who deserved better than a system built entirely to favor the wealthiest and most ruthless man among them. We ride tonight, Declan said finally. Take the back trails. Avoid the main road where Blackwood's men are likely watching. If we're fast enough, we might reach the cliff before they finish setting their charges. I'm coming too, Cal said immediately. Your leg's still healing, wounds mostly closed. I can ride, and I can shoot, and you'll need every gun you can get if Blackwood sent a real force up there. Cal's jaw set with quiet determination. This is my fight too, Declan, same as it's yours. Declan studied his old friend for a long moment before nodding, understanding there wasn't time to argue the point further. They gathered what supplies they could quickly: ammunition, rope, Maeve's carefully preserved documentation secured in waterproof oilcloth against her chest, and rode out into the darkness less than an hour after Cal's warning arrived. The ride north was brutal, the trail treacherous in darkness, ice patches hidden beneath fresh snow, threatening to send horses stumbling with every mile. Maeve kept pace as best she could, grateful for the riding skills Declan had taught her during their weeks together. Trusting her horse's instincts more than her own eyes, in the darkness, pressing close around them. They heard the first gunshots as dawn began breaking gray and cold over the eastern ridges. They're already there, Declan said grimly, urging his horse faster despite the treacherous footing. Someone's fighting them off. Who would be up there, fighting Blackwood's men? No idea, but we're about to find out. They crested the final ridge as full daylight broke across the mountain, revealing a scene that stole the breath from Maeve's lungs. Below them, at the base of the cliff where the crimson foliage still grew thick along the rock face, a fierce battle was already underway. A handful of local ranchers, men Maeve recognized vaguely from town, had positioned themselves among the rocks, exchanging gunfire with a much larger force of Blackwood's hired men working to set charges along the base of the cliff. Homesteaders, Declan said, understanding dawning across his face. Word must have spread about what Blackwood was planning. These are the same families he's been squeezing for years. They're outnumbered, Maeve observed, watching the exchange of gunfire with growing dread. And Blackwood's men are still setting those charges regardless. Declan didn't hesitate. He drew his rifle and spurred his horse down the slope, Cal right behind him. Both men, riding straight into the chaos below with a determination that left Maeve scrambling to keep pace. The battle that followed blurred together in fragments for Maeve. Afterward, gunfire echoing off rock walls, horses screaming, men shouting orders and warnings in the chaos. Declan fought with a controlled fury she'd never witnessed in him before, using every inch of cover the terrain offered, his shots precise and economical even as Blackwood's men pressed their advantage in numbers. Maeve took cover behind a boulder near the base of the cliff, watching in horror as one of Blackwood's men lit a fuse leading toward the charges set along the rock face. If those explosives went off, everything they'd worked to document, everything that could prove the true boundary line, would be buried under tons of shattered stone. She made a decision in that instant, one she didn't fully think through beyond the desperate need to save what mattered most. She broke from cover and ran. Maeve. Declan's voice tore through the chaos, panic evident even amid the gunfire. But she didn't stop, didn't slow, sprinting toward the lit fuse with everything her legs could give her. She reached it just as the flame crept dangerously close to the main charge, and without thinking, without any plan beyond instinct, she stomped it out beneath her boot, grinding the smoldering fuse into the snow until every last spark died completely. A bullet whined past her head, close enough that she felt the wind of it against her cheek, and she dropped instinctively behind a nearby rock, heart hammering so hard she could barely think straight. Declan's rifle answered immediately, covering fire that gave her precious seconds to catch her breath and assess the chaos still raging around her. "That's the last one of the homesteaders shouted, and Maeve realized with a rush of relief that between the rancher's resistance and Declan's precise shooting, most of Blackwood's remaining charges had either failed to detonate or been disabled entirely. But the fight itself was far from over. Blackwood's men, realizing their mission had failed, shifted their focus toward simply overwhelming the outnumbered defenders through sheer force, pressing forward with renewed aggression. "We can't hold this position much longer," Cal shouted, reloading with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and exertion. Declan's eyes scanned the battlefield with the calculating focus of a man who'd spent his whole life learning to survive impossible odds. "The judge's Matrain," he said suddenly. "What time does it arrive?" "This afternoon," Maeve managed, still catching her breath behind her rock. "Why? Because if we can hold out until then, get word to the judge directly about what's happening here. Blackwood's entire operation collapses in front of a federal witness. No forged paperwork, no bribed local officials can protect him from that kind of exposure. That's hours away, Declan. We might not survive that long up here. We don't have another option." He fired another precise shot, dropping one of Blackwood's men who'd gotten too close to the homesteader's position. "Cal, can you make it down to the rail station? Warn the judge what's happening. Bring back whatever federal marshals are traveling with him." Cal nodded grimly, already calculating the fastest route down the mountain that would avoid Blackwood's remaining forces. "I can make it. Just keep this position held until I get back." "We'll hold it," Declan said, though the confidence in his voice didn't quite mask the exhaustion and strain evident in every line of his body. Cal disappeared down a narrow trail Maeve hadn't even noticed, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew this mountain better than any map could show. That left Declan, Maeve, and the small group of homesteaders to hold their position against Blackwood's remaining men for however many hours it took for help to arrive. The fighting continued in fits and starts throughout the morning. Brief exchanges of gunfire followed by tense standoffs as both sides assessed their dwindling resources. Maeve found herself pressed into service tending wounds among the homesteaders, using what limited medical supplies she'd managed to grab before leaving the ranch. Grateful, once again, for skills that seemed to matter more with each passing hour spent in this brutal territory. "You're the healer from town," one of the wounded men said as she worked to bind a graze along his forearm, the one everybody's been talking about. I suppose I am. Heard you stood up to Blackwood's men once already, over the water rights. He winced as she tightened the bandage. Figured, maybe, you'd gone soft after he ran you out of your shop. Didn't expect to see you charging straight at a lit fuse instead. Some things are worth the risk, Maeve said, echoing words she'd spoken before, though they felt different now. Tested and proven true through everything they'd survived together these past weeks. By early afternoon, exhaustion had settled heavy over everyone still holding the defensive position. Ammunition running dangerously low. The sun beginning its slow descent toward the western peaks, with still no sign of Cal returning with help. Declan's face had gone pale beneath the strain of the day's fighting. His healing wound clearly paining him more than he was willing to admit, though he refused every suggestion that he retreat to safety and let the homesteaders handle what remained of the standoff. We're not backing down now, he said, when Maeve tried once more to convince him to rest. Not after everything we've already survived to get here. You're going to reopen that wound if you keep pushing yourself like this. Better a reopened wound than losing everything we've worked to prove. He managed a tired smile despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his face. Besides, can't very well let you charge at lit dynamite alone and not expect me to match that kind of reckless courage. Maeve almost laughed despite the tension still gripping the mountain around them, despite the very real danger still surrounding every one of them. There was something steadying in his presence beside her, something that had grown slowly through weeks of shared hardship into a partnership neither of them had expected to find in this harsh, unforgiving territory. The sound of approaching hooves interrupted whatever she might have said next, and every person still holding the defensive position tensed, weapons raised, uncertain whether reinforcements had finally arrived or whether Blackwood had somehow summoned additional men to finish what his original force had failed to accomplish. Then, Cal's voice rang out clear across the mountainside, breathless with exertion, but unmistakably triumphant. Judge is coming. Federal marshals right behind him. Relief swept through the exhausted defenders like a physical wave, and even Blackwood's remaining men seemed to understand immediately what this development meant for their employer's carefully constructed criminal enterprise. Several of them began retreating even before the approaching riders came fully into view, understanding better than most exactly how quickly loyalty evaporated once federal law entered the equation. Maeve rose from where she'd been tending wounds throughout the long afternoon, watching as a group of riders crested the ridge below. An older man, in formal dress, flanked by several marshals wearing federal badges that caught the afternoon sunlight. That's him, Declan said quietly, coming to stand beside her despite his obvious exhaustion. That's the judge. Maeve reached instinctively for the oilcloth package still secured against her chest, feeling the weight of everything contained within it. Weeks of careful documentation, pressed specimens, boundary comparisons that could finally, after everything they'd survived to protect it, be presented to someone with the actual authority to make things right. Then let's go show him exactly what we've been fighting to save, she said, and together they began making their way down toward the approaching riders, toward whatever reckoning finally awaited Josiah Blackwood after years of unchecked cruelty across this territory. The judge's name was Elias Whitmore, and he had the look of a man who had spent 30 years listening to liars and had grown tired of it. He rode down the slope, flanked by 4 federal marshals, their coats dark against the snow, badges catching what remained of the afternoon light. Cal rode just ahead of them, pointing back toward the cliff, talking fast, explaining everything he'd seen in the hours since he'd left to find help. Blackwood's remaining men had scattered by the time the marshals arrived, most of them abandoning their positions the moment federal badges came into view. A few tried to make a run for their horses. The marshals rounded them up without much trouble, men who'd been brave enough to burn a homestead in the dark, suddenly finding very little courage left. Once actual consequences rode into sight, Declan and Maeve made their way down to meet the judge, picking through the aftermath of the battle, past homesteaders, binding wounds and gathering their things, past the cliff face, still standing, still intact. The crimson foliage, untouched by whatever destruction Blackwood had intended for it. Judge Whitmore dismounted slowly, taking in the scene with sharp, assessing eyes. He was older than Maeve expected, gray-haired, weathered from years of circuit, riding through rough territory. But there was nothing soft about the way he studied the battlefield in front of him. "Somebody want to explain to me," he said, "why I rode into the middle of a gunfight on my way to a routine land inspection." Declan stepped forward first, though Maeve could see the exhaustion pulling at him, the strain of the day's fighting sitting heavy across his shoulders. "Your Honor, my name is Declan Hayes. This is my land we're standing on, or at least it was, before Josiah Blackwood decided to steal it through a forged survey." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Hayes. It's a provable one." Maeve stepped forward beside him, pulling the oilcloth package free from beneath her coat. "Your Honor, my name is Maeve Sterling. I'm a trained botanist and apothecary, formerly of Boston. I have documentation here that proves Blackwood's survey lines don't match the original treaty boundaries established for this territory." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly, skepticism evident in the set of his mouth. Documentation from a botanist, not exactly standard evidence for a boundary dispute. "No, sir, it isn't standard, but it's accurate in ways paperwork alone often isn't." Maeve held her ground, refusing to let his skepticism shake her resolve. "There's a plant growing along that cliff face behind us, one that only takes root under very specific conditions: soil composition, elevation, water table depth. It grows in an unbroken line that matches, precisely, a stone boundary marker still standing near the tree line above us, a marker that predates any survey Blackwood has ever filed. And you're suggesting a plant's growth pattern should override a legally filed survey." "I'm suggesting that a forged survey isn't legal at all, regardless of what paperwork Blackwood filed, to make it look official." Maeve kept her voice steady, though her heart pounded hard against her ribs. "Nature doesn't take bribes, Your Honor. It doesn't answer to intimidation or dynamite. That cliff has been telling the truth about this boundary for longer than any of us have been alive. Blackwood simply hoped nobody would bother listening to it before he found a way to destroy the evidence entirely." The judge's expression shifted slightly, something considering behind his sharp eyes. He glanced toward the cliff face, toward the crimson foliage still visible even at this distance, then back toward the scattered evidence of the day's violence: the wounded homesteaders, the abandoned crates of dynamite still sitting near the base of the rock. "That true?" he asked, turning toward one of the marshals who had already begun inspecting the explosives left behind. "Somebody tried to blow up a hillside today." "Looks that way, Your Honor," the marshal confirmed, kneeling beside one of the crates. Charges were set, some partially detonated. Whoever set these meant business. "Blackwood's men," Declan said, "came up here last night to destroy the evidence before you ever had a chance to see it. Local ranchers caught wind of what he was planning and tried to stop them. We rode up as fast as we could once we heard, but the fighting had already started." Judge Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, studying both of them with the particular scrutiny of a man who'd learned through decades of experience not to trust easy explanations. "You understand what you're accusing Josiah Blackwood of, Mr. Hayes? Fraud, attempted destruction of evidence, possibly worse, depending on what happened to whoever set off that gunfire." "I understand it entirely, Your Honor. I've lived under the weight of what that man's willing to do for 6 years now." Declan's voice hardened. Old exhaustion and old grief bleeding through the careful control he'd maintained all day. "Watched him starve my land of water. Watched him burn a family's homestead to the ground over a debt they couldn't pay because he'd already cut off their water too. Watched him nearly kill the woman standing beside me. Twice now, because she had the courage to gather proof of what he's been doing to this entire territory." Maeve reached for his hand without thinking, steadying him as much as steadying herself. And the judge's eyes tracked the movement, something flickering behind his weathered expression that might have been the beginning of belief. "Show me," he said finally, "this plant of yours, and bring whatever documentation you've prepared. I'll make my own assessment before I decide anything." They led him toward the cliff face, the marshals following close behind, weapons still drawn in case any of Blackwood's scattered men decided to return. Maeve walked him through everything, methodically. The growth pattern of the crimson foliage, the precise elevation where it appeared and disappeared. The old stone marker still standing near the tree line with its faded but legible carvings. "My grandfather showed me this marker when I was a boy," Declan explained, kneeling beside the weathered stone. "Told me it marked the true boundary, before anybody in this territory started arguing over deeds and surveys drawn up by men who'd never even walked this land themselves." Judge Whitmore examined the marker carefully, running his fingers over the worn carving, comparing its position against the line of foliage still visible climbing the rock above them. He pulled a small notebook from inside his coat and made careful notes, occasionally glancing back toward Maeve for clarification on specific botanical details. "You said this plant requires specific soil conditions," he said. "Explain that to me plainly. I'm no scientist." "Certain minerals concentrate along particular geological fault lines," Maeve said, choosing her words carefully to make the science accessible without oversimplifying it. This territory's original treaty boundaries were drawn following those same natural features: rivers, ridgelines, elevation changes, because that's how boundaries were established before modern surveying tools existed. This plant only takes root where those specific mineral concentrations exist in the soil. It's not coincidence that it follows this exact line, Your Honor. It's confirmation. The land itself remembers where the true boundary sits, even if the paperwork's been forged to say otherwise." The judge studied the foliage for a long moment, then turned back toward the marker. Then toward the pressed specimens and careful sketches Maeve pulled from her oilcloth package. He examined each page methodically, comparing her documented measurements against what he could observe himself along the cliff face. "This is thorough work," he said finally, something grudging in his admission. "More thorough than most surveys I've reviewed in my career. Frankly, thank you, Your Honor. That's not necessarily praise, Miss Sterling. It's an observation." He closed her notebook and handed it back carefully. "I'll need to verify this against the original treaty documents filed with the territorial government. Compare Blackwood's survey against what you're claiming here. That will take time." "Time's exactly what Blackwood's been counting on," Maeve said. "Every season he delays justice. More families lose their land, their water, their homes, to a man operating entirely on fraud and intimidation." Before the judge could respond, one of the marshals called out from further down the slope, urgency clear in his voice. "Your Honor, riders approaching." Everyone turned toward the sound of approaching hooves, tension rippling immediately through the group. Maeve's stomach tightened, fearing Blackwood had somehow rallied additional men, prepared for a second assault now that his initial attempt to destroy the evidence had failed. But it wasn't more hired guns riding toward them. It was Blackwood himself. He came alone, dressed in his usual fine clothing despite the rugged terrain. His silver hair catching the afternoon light as he reined in his horse, a careful distance from the marshal's drawn weapons. His expression remained composed, almost pleasant, the same cold confidence Maeve remembered from their encounter in her ruined apothecary. "Judge Whitmore," he said, dismounting smoothly. "I heard there was some commotion up here. Came to see if I could offer any assistance in sorting out whatever misunderstanding has occurred." Misunderstanding. The judge's tone had gone flat, careful. The tone of a man reassessing everything he'd been told against new information arriving in front of him. "That's an interesting word for what happened here today, Mr. Blackwood. Gunfire, dynamite, apparently an attempt to destroy evidence relevant to a land dispute." Blackwood's smile never wavered, though something calculating shifted behind his eyes. I'm afraid whoever's told you that story has been less than honest. Your Honor, this territory's rough. Disputes between ranchers turn violent more often than any of us would like. I certainly had no part in any dynamite. The crates found at the base of this cliff say otherwise. The marshal interjected, gesturing toward the abandoned explosives still visible nearby. I'm sure I have no idea how those got there, Blackwood said smoothly. Perhaps Mr. Hayes here arranged this whole scene himself, hoping to discredit a legitimate business rival through elaborate theatrics. He gestured toward Declan and Maeve with practiced disdain. It wouldn't be the first time desperate people concocted stories to avoid honoring legal debts and boundary agreements. There's nothing legal about a forged survey, Maeve said, stepping forward despite Declan's hand tightening protectively on her arm. You know that better than anyone. Mr. Blackwood, since you're the one who forged it. Blackwood's eyes settled on her fully for the first time, something cold and dangerous flickering beneath his composed exterior. Miss Sterling, I did warn you, didn't I? About the consequences of continuing to interfere in matters that don't concern you. You threatened me. Maeve corrected. There's a difference between a warning and a threat, Mr. Blackwood, though I imagine a man like you has trouble distinguishing between the two. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack Maeve had seen in his careful composure since he'd arrived. Your Honor, I'd caution you against taking the word of an outsider woman and a half-breed rancher over the documented survey I filed years ago through proper legal channels. The judge's expression hardened at that, something in Blackwood's casual cruelty seeming to finally tip whatever careful neutrality he'd maintained throughout the confrontation. Mr. Blackwood, I've spent 30 years riding circuit through this territory, listening to men just like you explain away every accusation with practiced confidence and careful words. But I've also learned to trust physical evidence over convenient explanations. Physical evidence provided by a woman with no formal standing in this territory's legal matters. A woman with medical and scientific training, presenting documented, verifiable evidence that directly contradicts your survey's claims. The judge's voice carried an authority that seemed to finally register with Blackwood, whose confident expression flickered for just a moment. I intend to have your original survey compared directly against the treaty documents filed with the territorial government. If Miss Sterling's findings prove accurate, and this old boundary marker certainly suggests they will, you're facing charges considerably more serious than a simple land dispute. Blackwood's composure cracked fully then, something desperate and ugly showing through the careful mask he'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. This is absurd. I've built the largest cattle operation in 3 counties through honest business practices. I won't have my life's work destroyed based on the ravings of a woman who talks to plants and a man who barely qualifies as careful. Mr. Blackwood, the judge interrupted sharply. I'd think carefully about what you say next, given the circumstances you currently find yourself standing in. Blackwood's hand moved, subtle but unmistakable, toward the pistol holstered at his hip. Every marshal present tensed immediately, weapons raising in response. And Declan pulled Maeve behind him without hesitation, his own rifle already coming up despite his exhaustion. Don't, the lead marshal warned, voice hard as flint, hands coming off that pistol slow, or you're not walking away from this mountain at all. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Blackwood's eyes flicked between the marshals, between Declan's rifle, between Maeve standing steady despite the danger, calculating odds that had clearly turned decisively against him. Then, slowly, he raised his hands away from his weapon. This isn't over, he said, venom finally breaking through his careful composure entirely. I have friends in territorial government, judges who understand how business actually works out here. You think a plant and an old stone are going to undo everything I've built. I think the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, Mr. Blackwood, Maeve said, stepping forward, despite Declan's attempt to keep her shielded. No matter how much money or intimidation a person uses to bury it, you cannot kill the truth of nature. No matter how many dynamite crates you bring to try. Judge Whitmore nodded to his marshals. Take him into custody. We'll sort out the full scope of these charges once I've had proper time to review the evidence. But attempted destruction of evidence and threatening federal witnesses is more than enough to hold him for now. The marshals moved efficiently, disarming Blackwood and securing his hands despite his continued protests, his composed veneer collapsing entirely into desperate, furious denial as they led him toward a waiting horse. Maeve watched the man who had burned her apothecary, who had starved Declan's land of water, who had ordered a family's homestead ablaze over a manufactured debt, finally facing consequences for actions he'd assumed would never catch up to him. It didn't feel like triumph exactly. It felt like something steadier than that. Relief, maybe. Or the particular satisfaction of watching a long overdue reckoning finally arrive. Your evidence is compelling, Miss Sterling, Judge Whitmore said, once Blackwood had been led away, his voice softer now, genuine respect replacing the earlier skepticism. I'll need you to formally testify once we've completed our investigation. Your documentation, combined with witness accounts from today's events, should be more than sufficient to overturn Blackwood's fraudulent claims permanently. I'll testify to everything I've witnessed and documented, Your Honor. Gladly. The judge studied her for a moment longer, something like genuine curiosity behind his weathered expression. Unusual path for a woman from Boston to end up on, gathering plants to overturn land fraud in a territory this rough. I came west believing medicine and science should serve everyone equally, regardless of what proper society expects. Maeve glanced toward Declan, exhausted but steady beside her. Turns out that belief applies just as well to justice. 6 months passed before the federal decree finally arrived, restoring the legitimate boundaries across the territory and formally overturning every fraudulent survey Blackwood had filed during his years of unchecked expansion. He stood trial in the territorial capital, convicted on charges of fraud, arson, and attempted destruction of federal evidence, sentenced to a term in prison that finally matched the scope of harm he'd caused across the region. The families he'd cheated and displaced began, slowly to rebuild. Water rights were restored along the creeks he'd dammed illegally. Homesteaders whose land he'd stolen through forged deeds saw their original boundaries recognized once more, their claims validated by the same careful documentation Maeve had gathered on that cold mountainside. Maeve used part of the settlement awarded through the territorial court to build a proper clinic in town. Sturdy brick instead of the wooden structure Blackwood had burned, sitting on a plot of land that no longer belonged to men who wanted her silenced. She filled it with shelves of dried herbs, careful jars of tinctures, and a growing library of medical texts she'd sent for from Boston. Determined never again to lose everything to a single act of cruelty, she taught classes there twice weekly, teaching herbal medicine to poor women who couldn't afford proper doctors, teaching native children the medicinal knowledge their own elders had once carried. Knowledge nearly lost to generations of dismissal and displacement. Declan often stopped by during these sessions, watching from the doorway as she demonstrated proper root harvesting techniques, or explained which plants could ease fever, which could clean a wound, which held dangers a careless hand might otherwise miss. You've built something this territory needed for a long time, he told her one afternoon, watching her wrap a poultice for an elderly woman who'd walked 3 miles for treatment. Proper medicine that doesn't care what a person looks like or where they came from. That was always the point, Maeve said, though something warm settled through her at his obvious pride. Medicine should never have needed to prove itself worthy of serving everyone equally. It's a shame it took this long and this much loss to finally make that true out here. The ranch itself had transformed as well over those 6 months, the creek running full and clean once more, now that Blackwood's illegal dam had been dismantled by federal order. Grass had returned to the pastures, thick and green despite the harsh winters this territory still threw at anyone foolish enough to underestimate them. Cal had taken over much of the daily ranch work, healed fully now, moving with the easy confidence of a man who no longer feared losing everything to another man's greed. Declan had rebuilt the house too, expanding it slightly, adding a proper room where Maeve now spent most nights when she wasn't needed at the clinic in town. Neither of them had spoken formally of marriage, not yet, but the arrangement had settled into something neither wanted to disturb by rushing toward labels that didn't quite capture what they'd built together. Folks in town have stopped whispering, mostly, Declan observed one evening, watching her prepare dried roots on the porch, the setting sun casting everything in warm gold light. Still some who won't look me in the eye, but plenty more who've started nodding when we pass, even shaking my hand now and then. Change happens slowly, Maeve said, tying off a bundle of yarrow with practiced efficiency. But it happens, especially once people see with their own eyes that the old ways of thinking never actually served anyone well, except men like Blackwood, who used prejudice as a tool to keep everyone else fighting each other instead of fighting him. You really believe that? That people can change how they see things? I believe some people can, given enough evidence and enough time. She glanced up at him, sun catching the auburn in her hair, the confident set of her shoulders that had only grown stronger through everything they'd survived together. I believe the ones who matter most already have. Declan crossed the porch and settled beside her, careful not to disturb the neat rows of drying herbs spread across the boards. He'd healed fully from his injury months ago, though a faint scar remained along his ribs, a permanent reminder of everything they'd fought through to reach this quiet, golden evening together. Cal mentioned something today, he said, a slight hesitation in his voice that caught her attention immediately. Said the county's planning to name that mountain past something official, the one with the cliff, where we found the evidence that finally brought Blackwood down. What are they planning to call it? Sterling Ridge. He watched her reaction carefully. Your name, on account of everything you uncovered up there. Judge Whitmore apparently put in the recommendation himself. Maeve set down the herbs she'd been sorting, something complicated moving behind her expression. Pride, mixed with the particular humility of someone who'd never expected recognition for simply doing what seemed right. Plant deserves more credit than I do. I only knew enough to recognize what it was trying to tell us. Knowing how to listen properly is its own kind of skill. Maeve. Most people spend their whole lives walking past truth without ever bothering to notice it's there. Declan reached over and took her hand, calluses rough against her palm, familiar now in a way that felt like coming home. This territory's better because you were patient enough to listen when it mattered most. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, as the sun continued its slow descent toward the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet that reminded her still of that first terrible night when he'd kicked open her apothecary door, carrying a bleeding man in his arms. So much had changed since then. The town, the land itself, both of them, transformed by everything they'd survived together. Do you ever think about what would have happened? She asked quietly. If that storm hadn't hit the night Cal got hurt, if you'd taken him somewhere else, or if I'd turned you both away like every other doctor in town. Think about it sometimes, Declan admitted, mostly grateful. I'll never have to know the answer. He pressed a soft kiss into her hair, the gesture familiar now, comfortable in a way that spoke to months of quiet devotion neither of them had expected to find on this hard, unforgiving frontier. This land taught me a long time ago that everything worth having usually shows up disguised as trouble at first. Guess that includes you too. Maeve laughed softly, the sound carrying easily across the peaceful evening settling over the ranch. I suppose that makes you the most stubborn trouble I've ever chosen to keep around. Mr. Hayes wouldn't have it any other way. They sat together as the sun finished its descent, the roots and herbs drying steadily around them, the ranch quiet and full in ways it hadn't been in years. The creek running clear and strong through pastures, no longer threatened by another man's greed, somewhere beyond the ridge. Sterling Ridge now, carrying her name forward into whatever future this territory built for itself. The crimson foliage continued, growing along the ancient boundary line it had always known, patient and unbothered by human conflict, simply telling the truth to anyone willing enough to listen. The land once scarred by fire and forged deeds and years of unchecked cruelty had begun healing in earnest now, sprouting something neither Declan nor Maeve had expected to find when they'd first met on that violent, rain-soaked night. Not just survival, though survival had certainly mattered plenty along the way. Something steadier than that. Something rooted deep enough to weather whatever storms this unforgiving territory still had left to offer. Declan pressed another kiss into her hair, and Maeve closed her eyes, letting herself simply exist in this quiet moment. Two people once considered outcasts by a world too narrow to recognize their worth, now firmly planted in a home built entirely on their own terms. The golden light faded slowly into evening, stars beginning their steady climb across the darkening sky, and neither of them moved from the porch for a long while yet, content simply to remain exactly where they belonged. As the last winter snow melted across Lonesome Ridge, Maeve and Declan's story left behind something far greater than a victory over one powerful enemy. It reminded everyone that true strength is not always found in a loaded rifle, a famous name, or the amount of land a man owns. Sometimes, real strength lives in the quiet courage of a woman who refuses to abandon someone in need, even when helping him places her own life in danger. Maeve did not save Declan because she expected a reward. She saved him because compassion would not allow her to walk away. In doing so, she proved that kindness is not weakness. Kindness becomes powerful when it is guided by courage, wisdom, and the willingness to stand against injustice. Declan's journey also teaches us that even the strongest people can carry wounds no one else can see. He knew how to survive storms, violence, and the unforgiving wilderness. But trusting another person was a far more difficult battle. Maeve did not heal him with herbs and honey alone. She healed him by showing him that he did not have to face every danger by himself. Her patience gave him a reason to believe that love could be more than another promise waiting to be broken. And Declan, in return, gave Maeve something she had long been denied, the freedom to be seen, respected, and valued for who she truly was. Their story reminds us that love is not simply born in peaceful moments. Sometimes it begins in darkness, inside a frozen cave, when two frightened people choose to protect each other. Love becomes real through sacrifice, honesty, and loyalty. It is not about finding someone perfect. It is about finding someone who sees your scars, understands your fears, and still chooses to remain by your side. The truth they uncovered also carries an important lesson. Wealth and power may silence people for a time, but they cannot bury the truth forever. A cruel man may control the land, frighten a town, and purchase the loyalty of dishonest men. But his power begins to collapse the moment ordinary people find the courage to stand together. Evil survives when good people believe they are alone. But once fear is replaced by unity, even the most powerful tyrant can fall. Perhaps the greatest lesson from Maeve and Declan's journey is that our past does not have to decide our future. Pain may shape us, betrayal may harden us, and loss may make us afraid to hope again, but none of those things must become the ending of our story. Healing begins when we allow ourselves to trust again. Freedom begins when we stop believing the lies others have told us about our worth. And a new life begins when we finally choose courage over fear. So as we leave Lonesome Ridge behind, remember this. One act of mercy can save a life. One brave voice can expose a powerful lie. And one honest love can give two wounded hearts a reason to begin again. No winter lasts forever. Even after the coldest night, morning will come, and sometimes the person standing beside you when the sun rises is the home you were searching for all along. Thank you for staying with Maeve and Declan until the end. If their journey touched your heart, share this story with someone who still believes in courage, second chances, and a love strong enough to survive the wild frontier. And don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories from the American West. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional, while it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences. It does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.